There was some talk over the weekend about fudging. I am not a fudge person. I don't begrudge anybody who fudges. It's just a philosophy that I personally don't really agree with, but to each their own. This version of that conversation, which happens all the time, especially in the world of RPG social media, was a little bit different because this time one of the adherents to fudging, or at least that seems like the angle they were coming from, decided to quote from the DMG to support their position. Now, first of all, I would never feel like you need to quote from one of the rule books if you have a particular gaming style that you want to use. For myself, there are certain things that I believe in strongly in terms of playing the game. I don't need to go to the books to support them. If someone asks me, well, go and cite chapter and verse in the PHB or DMG of any edition to support it, I would say I don't need to. This is my own personal philosophy. However, they went down that rabbit hole, so I thought it'd be interesting to follow them down there and see what's going on and perhaps look at this, I don't know, evidence, if you want to use quote unquote evidence or whatever this support is. Now, specifically, there's a section in the DMG called the Rule of Dice, and this is on page 236, and we're talking about the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. There are a couple of sections here. I'm going to basically paraphrase the first two sections, or first three sections rather. Two sections, and then the third section I'll read the last paragraph, which was their main proof. So the first part, the first subheader is called Rolling With It, which is basically looking at that game style and saying, hey, if you want to roll all the time for everything, that's totally valid. And of course, I think if you've been around, you've seen that there are GMs that will absolutely roll for lots of stuff. I think I look at Critical Role, I think Matt Mercer is someone who asks their players to roll a lot. And they say, of course, this is totally valid. Then the second subheader is called Ignoring the Dice, which is basically the other side of the spectrum for saying that the playstyle, if you would like to rely on the dice as little as possible and use context and the wisdom of the GM, I suppose, and looking at skill numbers and just say, hey, yes, this works, this doesn't work, and not roll dice at all, also perfectly acceptable. The final subheader is called the middle path, which is some combination of both approaches. Sometimes you're going to rely on context to just say, yes, it works, or no, it can't work. And sometimes you're going to use the dice to decide if it's uncertain. I think you're with me so far? Everything makes sense. Now we get to the final paragraph of the middle path, which was what was specifically cited in the conversation I was following for saying, see, here's where the DMG says that fudging dice is essentially part of the rules. So I'm just going to read it in full, and then we'll go through it in a little bit of detail. Remember that dice don't run your game. You do. Dice are like rules. They're tools to help keep the action moving. At any time, you can decide that a player's action is automatically successful. You can also grant the player advantage on any ability check, reducing the chance of a bad die roll, foiling the character's plans. By the same token, a bad plan or unfortunate circumstances can transform the easiest task into an impossibility, or at least impose disadvantage. So seems pretty clear, right? And this is all fine and good. Now, you may have noticed, or you may not, depending on if you've seen these types of conversations and sort of theory debates back and forth, but the key point for the dice fudging point of view was this line right here. At any time, you can decide that a player's action is automatically successful. So what they're saying is at any time means after the dice are rolled, before the dice roll, right? Literally, at any time they can change the result. They can say, oh, you succeeded when you're not to. Now, in the conversation the context of this particular conversation, this was talking more about fudging in terms of highlighting characters, or not necessarily highlighting, but having players succeed. Let's say if a player was down on their luck and had been failing, you could fudge the dice to make them succeed. So they weren't looking at the inverse, which a lot of GMs also use with fudging, which is basically you could rule that a player's action is automatically unsuccessful. So they look at that at any time, and they're saying literally at any time. Before the dice are rolled, after the dice are rolled, I guess presumably 10 minutes later, I don't know. And I think that's part of that I'm making fun a little bit, or making a joke a little bit, but I really feel like that's where my first kind of issue comes up. Because if you're really going to take at any time at face value and say at any time we could change the result, it doesn't even say before the dice, after the dice, in that moment. Are we saying that the next session I could go and start retconning what dice rolls were. Oh, by the way, last session when you thought you hit this ogre, no, you missed. Or, oh, you didn't hit, but now you've hit. So I think if you're going to say, well, at any time literally means at any time, we can kind of take that to an absurd degree. 3 campaigns ago, you missed this thing. I decided now that you've hit it, right? It doesn't make sense. So I think looking at it and saying literally at any time during the game is probably not what they mean. That I would say, wording as intended. Literally, did they say you could do it at any time? Sure, but I don't think that's what they really mean. And if we look at the rest of this paragraph, I think we get a more of a context. So the next sentence is, at any time you can, so first we have, at any time you can decide that a player's action is automatically successful. You can also grant the player advantage on any ability check, reducing the chance of a bad die roll foiling the character's plans. So I think what they're talking about at any time, to me, my reading of this is in any particular part of the game, whether you're in a social situation, whether you're in combat, whether you're exploring, whether you're engaging with skills in any other different way, at any time, in any phase of the game, this is something you can do, as opposed to any time on a clock in terms of, could have been yesterday, could have been tomorrow, could be 5 minutes from now, could have been 5 minutes before. And then we're talking about saying, hey, you can grant a player advantage, which seems clearly that the context here is before the dice are rolled. You look at the situation, you look at the player, what they're doing, and they haven't rolled the dice yet, and you're thinking about it and say, hey, you know what? I just think that's going to work. Put the dice down. We don't need to do it. You're fine. And then we keep going. You can say, hey, by the same token, circumstances can transform the easiest task into an impossibility, or at least impose disadvantage, which is, again, pre-die roll. But in any phase of the game, you may look at the situation, and the player says, hey, I want to take my shield and throw it like a boomerang, like Captain America, off 3 walls and hit somebody, and you decide, hey, you know what, sorry, pal, but you're a bard. Not without any kind of magical assistance, that's impossible. And then maybe the wizard says, oh, but can I match his action and do prestidigitation? And you say, okay, now I'll allow it, but at disadvantage. Again, we're talking pre-dice rolling. I think the other thing that's important is that all these other options that they're giving here in terms of this paragraph are all talking to stuff that's player-facing. It's very open. You're not hiding this behind the screen. If you decide to give advantage, or you decide to give disadvantage, or you say it's automatic, or you say it's impossible, these are all things you're communicating openly to the player, which is different than fudging. I don't know anybody who, maybe there are folks who play with open fudging. I think there probably are, but for the most part, fudging is behind the screen. This is something that the players roll the dice, and then I decide behind the screen, without input of the players, without their knowledge, that I'm going to make sure this succeeds or I'm going to make sure this fails, which is, to me, very different than talking through a situation and saying, hey, because of the context, this or that, this task is going to be harder or impossible, this task is going to be easier, and then potentially automatic. So really what we have here is I think it's a stretch. I'm just going to say personally, I'm not a tenured philosopher or professor in the writings of Dungeons and Dragons, but I think if you're looking at that at any time and latching onto that and saying this is my justification for fudging, I would say I think you should probably look at your belief system, because again, I have no problems with fudging. If you want to fudge philosophically, that's fine. But if you're looking at that little line and saying this is it, this is my proof for saying at any time I can just change stuff up, I think that's, in my opinion, a little bit of wishful thinking, a little bit of really stretching it. And I just want to say, I feel like these kinds of conversations, like I said, I don't have a problem fudging. Just say, hey, I think fudging does this, that, and the other for my game. I found it helpful, so I do it. And that's perfectly fine. But trying to pour through the book and find these little things, like I said, if you take this at face value and take at any time, literally, you end up with it's then saying some weird things about the dice and what you can do with them, which I don't think makes sense. So I think we can say, hey, the literally at any time just doesn't work, because we can tell that's not what they mean. I also don't think in terms of advantage or disadvantage, maybe some folks play this way. I've never seen it where the player will roll dice and then the GM will go, no, wait, I want you to roll with disadvantage. It might happen every once in a while when you just forget, oh yeah, sorry, Bob, I meant to tell you had disadvantage and you only rolled 1 die, so you can roll another die. But I don't think that's meant to be our main mode of operating the game, is deciding after the dice have rolled, oh geez, they rolled a 20, disadvantage kind of thing. I don't think that's how that's meant to fly. And I would say, just as an aside, and I've had these kind of conversations before where I've lamented the way folks are reading these rules these days. And it's this kind of back and forth between the rule makers, in this case wizards, and the community. If we're going to force them to, we already will talk about how laborious the texts in these books are because of the way they say write out spell descriptions, the way they write things out. But then when I see people latching on this stuff and saying, oh, at any time, and then going down this path, now, hey, if you really believe that's what they're telling you, then I guess I can't help it. We just read it differently. But I think certainly there's nothing in there that says, hey, fudging is okay. And it's not like fudging is a new rule. If Wizards really wanted to tell you, for whatever reason, fudging is an absolutely one way we want you to dungeon master, they could have just written it literally in the book. They didn't need to hide it behind pseudo phrasing or kind of slip it in there. Oh, at any time you could do something and then we can interpret it. They could have just said in big bold letters, fudge the dice if you need to, if they wanted to. Okay, so there's also that. But the way we're picking apart this stuff, and I think looking at this sort of rules as written type ruling from a rules as intended type ruling, and splitting hairs and trying to find these gray spaces in the middle where we can insert our own interpretations, it just leads to less and less kind of common sense rules and more rules that resemble legalese. And I think that we can all agree the legalese rules that we're getting out of modern D&D, they're not fun to read. They end up in weird situations, like we talked about invisibility and see invisibility earlier, which I think is an issue because of legalese trying to cover all bases and maybe missing something and deciding that they have to just absorb it into the rules. They may say, no, that's my interpretation anyway. If we want things to change, we want to go to having, hey, can we just have something that's slim and trim and just tells us we can all just use our common sense and use just, I think, the way we would understand, kind of a mutual understanding of the rules. Then we need to not go down these rabbit holes. And if you want to fudge, if you want to do something, there's always that rule that says, hey, these are your rules, do with them what you will. That's the rule you should point to and say, hey, I like to fudge, and the rules say that this is my game and I can do with it what I will, so I'm going to fudge. And not try to sift through and find some little tiny phrase, some little tiny way that they decide to word it, and because they didn't close all the loopholes or dot all the I's, they forgot to cross a T, trying to slam through that little hole and open it up into something bigger and something definitely not intended. Anyway, that's my take. I'm interested in your take. Let me know in the comments, wherever you end up finding this. Other than that, game on, and I'll talk to you later.